It is folly to believe that desirable and predictable outcomes can come from extremely complex systems by resorting to simplistic assumptions and regulations. This statement was written by Robert G. Wagner, Ph.D., a professor in the Forestry and Natural Resources Department at Purdue University in Maine. And I find it ironic such a wise-seeming statement comes from a man who, if you examine his track record, has a master's in ecology and silviculture, but is in fact a scientist in forestry, and apparently, despite a PhD in the field, does not understand the difference between the two. For ecology is the science of understanding the interactions and interrelationships between life and the environmental conditions that support life. Forestry is simple by contrast, building on ecology's insights, but it is really about the processes, techniques, and technology used in harvesting a forest. And lately it has incorporated a great deal of silviculture, the farming of trees. But a forester is no more an ecologist than a farmer is a biologist. The difference is, farmers are wise enough to know the difference. In preparing for this delicate video, I have perused a great deal of the works of Robert G. Wagner, and there is no doubt in my mind that the man is very knowledgeable about forestry. However, given his past interactions with Forest Nova Scotia, known a little over 10 years ago as the Forest Products Association of Nova Scotia, I find myself critically questioning his expertise as well as his ethics. Because in 2010, he was hired by Forest Nova Scotia, then known as the Forest Products Association of Nova Scotia, to assassinate the work of Bob Bancroft and Donna Crosland, respected Nova Scotia scientists who were tasked, along with John Porter, to make recommendations for the development of healthy ecologies and forests in Nova Scotia, while also preserving Nova Scotia's role as a leader within the world of forestry. And then, just as now in 2021, Forest Nova Scotia took it upon itself to put a stop to the effort to develop standards, education, and regulation to promote the development of ecologically sound and biodiversity promoting forestry practices. Here in 2021, Forest Nova Scotia is presently most infamous for the creation of an astroturf organization called the Concerned Private Landowner Coalition, which exists for the sole purpose of stopping the passage of the Biodiversity Act, or at least gutting it to the point that it has no teeth. Having no clout among Nova Scotians, Forest Nova Scotia used the CPLC to then make unverifiable claims that many thousands of Nova Scotia woodlands owners and landowners were deeply concerned about the passage of a Biodiversity Act. Forest Nova Scotia, through the Concerned Private Landowner Coalition, augmented these claims through a campaign of fear-based advertisements that it ran through various radio stations and newspapers all around the province and continues to do so at the time of the recording of this video. This fear-based campaign was specifically intended to divide rural versus urban Nova Scotians and turn people against conservationists in general, specifically by framing them as evil activists who want to control their land. It was a dirty and underhanded campaign that stretches any boundary of ethics and standards, and it is a wonder to me that Forest Nova Scotia is not yet being investigated. But this is not the first time that Forest Nova Scotia has turned to such low and underhanded tactics. In 2010, Forest Nova Scotia used a similar set of strategies to destroy the movement back then toward forestry reforms that would promote conservation and better environmental standards. But rather than a broad and manipulative, disinformative public ad war, in 2010, Forest Nova Scotia spent a great deal of money to solicit what are clearly biased reviews from big forestry industry pundits, and very specifically targeting Bob Bancroft and Donna Crosland for character and professional integrity assassination. The story is roughly this. In 2010, Bob Bancroft, Donna Crosland, and John Porter were engaged by the Voluntary Planning Committee to explore the status of the Acadian forest in Nova Scotia and devise a plan to rejuvenate those forests and implement ecologically sustainable forestry. Bob Bancroft is a respected biologist who has spent his life in service to improving Nova Scotia's ecology and forests. Donna Crosland is a respected ecologist who presently works with Parks Canada. John Porter is a devotee of the forestry sector and was a manager at Bowater, a forestry and pulp company operating in Nova Scotia at that time. As might be expected, two scientists, one a biologist, one an ecologist, tasked with finding ways to improve the forest ecosystem and overall environment of Nova Scotia, would soon come to clash with a forestry technician, tasked with essentially finding ways to mine that forest, very much for the purpose of producing pulp for the pulp cartel. Of course, if one is going to put together a task force designed to study the state of environmental devastation throughout Nova Scotia and recommend ways to repair our broken forest ecosystem, one would expect to have trained scientists on that task force. So this begs the question, how and why did a pulp industry manager end up on this panel? I mean, if you're going to travel somewhere by air, you want a pilot. If you have a health condition, you want a doctor. If you have a devastated forest ecosystem, you want scientists. It's just reasonable, good sense. Well, Bob was there and far more familiar with the incident than I am. I'll let him describe it.
The department wanted John Porter in there because he was going to block the whole thing. And so here you have a government department who's going against their government's wishes in pursuing this. And the analogy I use, Cliff, is that the forestry bus is being driven by the forest industry. The government is in the back seats along for the dwindling number of jobs, and neither the government nor the forest industry wanted a public hand, a scienced public hand put on the steering wheel.
I've always liked something about Bob. He doesn't pull any punches. He's an honest man and he just says what he thinks and what he means. It's not a trait we often find among politicians, and we certainly don't see it going on much in the world of the forestry cartel, which my investigations have led me to believe use subterfuge, disinformation, and underhanded dirty dealing in such a way that, well, the word cartel is an apt description of them. Nevertheless, I spoke with Donna Crossland, who described this time as an optimistic time. She, as a newer scientist, had a faith that if you just shared good information, good insights with people, and in particular the government, they would make good choices. Here's Donna in her own words.
Well, it was such a shame because it was such a time of optimism, you know. It was, bringing the science to the table, and at that point, I really believe that being factual, being fact-based, and bringing the latest science to the table, that if they just knew and if they just understood the science, then everybody would get along, right? That we'd all fall into line and we do the right thing. Know better, do better.
Bob Bancroft and Donna Crossland both reported that almost immediately they began to run into hurdles with John Porter. And Bancroft states that he believes that Porter was placed in the role in order to create a solid roadblock against the development of an ecological forestry plan for the province.
We saw early on that he wasn't cooperating with us in terms of, we would put 3 inches of material about the need for a wider riparian zone, and half of it would be from Nova Scotia. So you couldn't say it was Maine and it didn't count. And he'd just look at us and say no. So we got the idea after a while that he was just headbutting us every time we tried to do something. So we separated. And we got into trouble. We tried to have him replaced by somebody from the industry who would actually help with the changes. And we got into trouble for that. And I understand now why, because the department wanted John to stop us.
That is a truly ominous statement. The Department of Lands and Forestry wanted John Porter to stop the selected scientists from developing standards to promote ecologically sound forestry in the province of Nova Scotia. John Porter, former manager at Bowater. John Porter, who is now the executive director of Renewable Resources. John Porter, who is now basically the poster boy of corporate capture for the pulp cartel. In the Halifax Examiner article, entitled Communication Specialists, hundreds of thousands of dollars were spent to produce blatant lies for the campaign against the Biodiversity Act, written by Joan Baxter, and published April 15, 2021. Her expert source, a communication specialist, estimates that Forest Nova Scotia would have had to have had inside knowledge of the intent of the government to propose the Biodiversity Act going back weeks or months in advance. But according to Bob Bancroft and Donna Crossland, this should come as no surprise. It is not the first time that agents of corporate capture have worked through key government positions and key roles within regulating agencies to sabotage the creation of ecologically sound and environmentally protecting policy. Namely, John Porter did not bring his recommendations nor his papers to review at the meetings. Donna Crossland describes them as having held his hand till the very last, though she adds that she wanted to understand the industry perspective on forestry and its balance with ecology in order to ensure they were making the best recommendations for both the environment and business.
Fair enough. I admittedly don't know very much about industry science. So please, John, do enlighten me. And by the way, where are your papers? Where is your information to enlighten me? And he never, ever had anything. And we very frankly told him that he was holding his cards awfully tightly to his chest, and we weren't being able to, we were being inhibited from integrating some of the important industry science and perspectives into the natural resources strategy, the document we were writing, which we wanted to be balanced with, some of the industry science, but we weren't getting it. We weren't getting the Nova Scotia flavor of what does industry need to flourish. It was all very silent.
They began to feel that his role there was to stonewall the process of developing a strategy to improve forest in the Nova Scotia environment, perhaps to see that it didn't come about at all. They could not have realized how right they were. Acting in the background was John Porter's former employer, Bowater Mercy Paper Company Limited, a fiber and resource pulp company, who, in June 8, 2010, quietly distributed a letter to their, quote, industry partners, unquote. And it was little more than the fear-mongering style of disinformation that we see presently from Forest Nova Scotia. While pretending to support landowner rights, their ultimate concern was that the report by Crossland and Bancroft, which made many scientifically supported and well-researched suggestions, might become the basis of new forestry policy in Nova Scotia. I have found a copy of the letter that Bowater sent to their industry partners. It is 4 pages long, and while I'm not going to read the entirety of it to you, it begins with a Forest Nova Scotia style of fear-mongering. Quoting, "I am writing you to express my concern with an issue that has the potential to limit the rights of all landowners and fiber producers in Nova Scotia to manage their forest lands and, ultimately, to seriously weaken our provincial forest industry." Their letter, as you can see in the first page shown here, claims that the Bancroft and Crossland report stands to severely restrict landowner rights, reduce wood supply, drive up costs to landowners and industries, and be extremely costly for government to implement. It proceeds in the next 3 pages, also shown above, to systematically attack the environmental protection recommendations by Bancroft and Crossland while praising and promoting the forestry industry doctrine that shaped John Porter's understanding of how forests work. And then it contained directions for forest owners to contact the Premier and the Minister of Natural Resources. It turns out Crossland and Bancroft were right. John Porter, or at least his former employer, were engaged in a campaign to stop the development of environmentally protective forestry standards and ecological development in Nova Scotia. And so in the end, Bancroft and Crossland had to agree to work together without Porter to develop their recommendations. When they submitted theirs, John Porter also submitted his. The recommendations are remarkably different. I've read both. In my opinion, Donna Crossland and Bob Bancroft presented an extremely well-researched and sound strategy intended to the best of their ability to promote the development of healthy and biodiverse forests through the development of a strategy to promote multi-age forest ecosystems comprised of local flora and fauna while minimizing pesticides and clear-cutting. Porter's paper was smaller and, predictably, espoused many of the strategies embraced by the forestry industry, justifying the use of herbicides, pesticides, and clear-cutting, with a focus on forests not as ecosystems, but typically as crops to be rotated and harvested, while, perhaps secondarily, attempting to maintain a biodiverse balance of ecology in there. To be fair to Porter and the report, he does in one place recommend slightly enlarging the buffer zones along watercourses, from 20 to 23 meters, though he is also careful to note that we should be cautious in how much we enlarge buffer zones, as it could financially impact forest owners who had watercourses crossing their lands. The thing is, Porter's report was not really an environmental assessment and set of recommendations to improve things. It is a slight revision of forestry industry doctrine, and looks at the forest as a resource to be mined, wherein environmental health comes second. Ultimately, Porter chose to use as his references industry scientists, industry research, and as is the problem with all such papers, that means bias, because money makes for conflicts of interest, and conflicts of interest make for bias. By contrast, in my opinion, Donna Crossland and Bob Bancroft used as the references for their work scientists not beholden to the forestry industry, research which no one could claim was biased. In a nutshell, they presented good science, done well, and presented well. This was not going to fly, and so the Forest Products Association of Nova Scotia, what eventually became Forest Nova Scotia, launched a dirty pool campaign, not too different from the campaign that was recently done through the proxy or AstroTurf organization, the Concerned Private Landowner Coalition. Part of that they did through mailouts to the various woodlot owners around Nova Scotia. Here is one of the documents they sent out. Shh, you weren't supposed to see this. Take a moment and pause the video and take a look at it closely. Does it look familiar to you? It is essentially the same formula of mindless fear-mongering that they are presently doing now in 2021 in their efforts to kill the Biodiversity Act. A one-page publication of some very inaccurate drivel designed specifically to incite the fears of woodlot owners. Claiming scientists Bancroft and Crossland were trying to kill the forestry industry, tooting false claims about the Bancroft-Crossland report, and urgent pleas for political action. But the Forest Nova Scotia letter alone wasn't going to do. See, the problem was, Donna Crossland and Bob Bancroft, being good scientists, presented good science. And because they cared about Nova Scotia's many woodlot owners, they recommended a whole slew of supports and incentives, even though Forest Nova Scotia sent out communications to those small private woodlot owners, telling them that Crossland and Bancroft wanted to destroy the forestry industry and did not care for them. You can see some of those recommendations for support for private woodlot owners noted above. Extend ecosystem-based forest management to private lands. Ensure credits and funding is equally available to all forest woodlot owners. Provide funding incentives for woodlot owners to develop uneven age stands of woods on their properties. Provide incentives to those landowners who have a forest management plan. And provide woodlot owners with a readily accessible website to allow them to access, on their own terms and according to their own discretion, the best contractors for silviculture and harvesting operations. The Bancroft and Crossland report promoted the devotion of tremendous resources to small private woodlot owners, and there it is in black and white. You private woodlot owners who were around in 2010, who got those letters from Forest Nova Scotia damning Bancroft and Crossland, here's your proof. Forest Nova Scotia lied to you. But because Bancroft and Crossland were good and honest scientists, another step had to be taken. Their characters had to be assassinated. And so into the picture came this guy, Robert G. Wagner, who bills himself as an academic and research leader in industry university partnerships promoting silviculture, forest management, forest regeneration, vegetation ecology, and management. Now, the guy is a PhD, and there's no arguing that he's an intelligent character. But what he does basically is forestry. He does research on how to get trees to grow more wood, how to keep the foliage from inhibiting the growth of the trees. As you can see in this flyer that he has up on his Maine Forest Product Council, he notes that herbicides are vital for preventing the spread of invasive exotic plants in Maine's forests. He's a significant proponent in the use of pesticides and herbicides. And yet, despite all his claims of expertise, if the paper that he wrote as an assessment of the work of Bancroft and Crossland versus Porter is any indication of the ethics that drive his work, frankly, I wouldn't hire this guy to manage my vegetable garden. Because to be quite honest, his paper criticizing their work is full of lies. I've read the entire thing end to end. And to be quite honest, if a first-year student submitted to me a paper on a scientific matter written like this, I would fail that student with a flat-out 0. And give that student a stern lecture on the fact that science is not a process of ad hominem attacks, no matter how subtle or not they might be. And that if that student wants to do well in the world of academia and science, that student had better learn to use facts and reason as argument strategies. Though at least he is transparent about who hired him and why he was there. He was hired by the Forest Products Association of Nova Scotia to review Donna Crossland and Bob Bancroft's work. Well, he claims it was also to review Porter's work. But in 23 pages of drivel, which Bancroft and Crossland both report he was paid $100,000 to write by the Forest Products Association, he spends 16 pages criticizing the work of Bancroft and Crossland in ways that are so out of touch, I honestly have to doubt that he entirely read their reports. For example, on page 2 he writes, "Unfortunately, the authors of the Bancroft and Crossland report did not adequately convey the depth or breadth of understanding about the effects of clear-cutting from the scientific literature, or specifically where and under what conditions the use of clear-cutting in Nova Scotia has been or is likely to be ecologically and economically unsustainable." I read Crossland and Bancroft's report. It most certainly does. Though it was lacking the input of their ostensibly forestry expert, Porter, who, they shared, simply refused to contribute. He writes about their lack of citation of the scientific literature, and these critiques appear on pages 2, 7, and 10. And this, frankly, is a misleading lie, because the scientific literature Crossland and Bancroft drew upon was vast, and in their paper there are some 130 references, all of which are shown above. Feel free to pause the video if you care to look any of them up. Robert G. Wagner wrote liberally and freely that he did not feel Donna Crossland and Bob Bancroft understood their fields, or anyone who has ever worked or studied with them is full well aware of their incredible and impressive array of skills and expertise. The problem with Bancroft and Crossland's report is it wasn't industry biased, which is to say, it didn't approach ecology in the same myopic way which Robert G. Wagner does, and it certainly doesn't recommend clear-cutting. It promotes what is to the industry of industrial forestry the aberrant idea of allowing forests to reach maturity and letting forests have uneven age stands to promote biodiversity, by cleaning air and holding soil, by sheltering the forest floor from the sun, by cooling the flowing watercourses that run through them. But the forestry industry is primarily interested in wood production per square foot, and that is where Bancroft and Crossland's report runs astray and awry from Wagner's own educated but simply profit-based understanding of forest and ecology. Of the report of John Porter, the Bowater manager, Wagner, predictably as a person operating essentially in the employ of Forest Nova Scotia, had very little in the way of critique to say. In fact, given the nature of Wagner's report, laughably little. Or at least it would be laughable were it not so clearly a suck-up to the forestry cartel which was cutting his paycheck. He manages a grand total of 558 words, about 2 typical manuscript pages. And I tell you, the guy deserves an Emmy for some serious kowtowing suck-up going on. Listen for yourself. Quoting, "No background or credentials of the author is presented, but it appeared to be authored by someone schooled and experienced in forest management principles and practice. It was also clear that the author had a forest industry focus and that this document was designed to counter several of the recommendations, especially related to clear-cutting, herbicides, whole tree harvesting, biomass, and intensive management in the Bancroft and Crossland report. The recommendations are far less drastic, call for a measured response to the public concerns identified in Phase 1, and I'm adding this, that being clear-cutting, back to quoting, and focus on subtle policy shifts and better education efforts. I tried my best to be as critical about the scientific and technical aspects of this report as I was with the Bancroft and Crossland reports. However, I found the recommendations to be largely constructive, measured, reasonable, and fairly well defended based on past and current research in the region, although the author clearly did not do a thorough literature review on every topic. In a nutshell, what Robert Wagner is saying is that, hey, the guy whose report I was paid to defend is pretty cool, and if nothing else, this is ecology as Wagner is trained to understand it, in which a forest's value is reduced to its capacity to produce wooden pulp. So Wagner must have been paid to defend the status quo. He virtually admits to this between pages 1 and 2, where he writes, quoting, "If the Porter report alone were implemented as part of this process, however, I suspect little would change with harvesting practices." Now bear in mind, Forest Nova Scotia hired this guy. They paid him for his opinion. And Forest Nova Scotia doesn't have a reputation for seeking fair and balanced opinions. Their goal was to maintain the status quo. And the eminent Robert G. Wagner has quite literally just said that he liked Porter's report. It maintains the status quo. And that, my fellow Nova Scotians, was Forest Nova Scotia's endgame. Keep the hack and slash going, no matter what. All the links to these papers and documents are listed below should you care to read them. They are lengthy, but Wagner's 23-page paper is the shortest, and it's what my biology professor back in my undergrad days would have called mercenary science. It wasn't good work, it wasn't meaningful work, it was in fact barely science at all. It was, in point of fact, a hatchet job. Commissioned by Forest Nova Scotia, pointed out on the very first line of the very first page, though then they were known as FPANS, the Forest Products Association of Nova Scotia, making very little in the way of meaningful recommendations, and really only going so far as to emphasize the point that, no matter what, nobody had better listen to the recommendations of Crossland and Bancroft, because God forbid, there should be a different approach than hack, slash, and spray, the traditional approach of the pulp industry in Nova Scotia and much of the world. Yes, that's my interpretation, but go ahead and read it. You'll find that my interpretation is not far from the mark. So this 23-page hatchet job was mailed by Forest Nova Scotia to woodlot owners all around the province, intended to build a fervor of fear around any kind of ecology and biodiversity-based approach to forestry in Nova Scotia. In effect, 2010 proved to be a prelude to what we are experiencing in 2021 with Forest Nova Scotia's blatant ad war and disinformation campaign against the passage of any kind of Biodiversity Act. Forest Nova Scotia wants one thing: business as usual, hack, slash, and spray forestry. And the evidence is pretty clear. They'll say anything, pay anything, and hire anyone who will spread that message. Both Bancroft and Crossland report that they had received tips that Forest Nova Scotia had paid or contributed in one way or another to Wagner on or about $100,000 to write this report. Here's Bob on the matter. How did Wagner get involved?
Wagner was contacted by FPANs to do it, and we'd encountered him when the panel went up to New Brunswick to talk to people up there. He came from Maine to give us his wisdom, and so we knew who he was. But they contacted him totally apart from the panel when they didn't like what we produced, and he whipped that up in a fairly short period of time, I guess, and they distributed it. So that paper, a Wagner paper that he wrote, it is still not public. They handed it out to all the woodland owners, and somebody sent me a copy. That they just decided that they needed some other ammunition to scare the woodland owners in this province into not wanting change, and so they went about it in the way that we've just talked about, $100,000, and put a bunch of lies together and slander the people that have done it, and ruin their credibility.
How did you find out what they paid him? I don't expect you to reveal the source, but somebody told you?
Well, I was a member of FPANs at the time.
Okay.
It was an expensive place to join, but I believe that if you're trying to get change, you should join part. And I was a woodlot owner, so I was in there, and one of the industry people came to me afterwards. He was very embarrassed, and he told me.
This hatchet job, commissioned by the then Forest Products Association of Nova Scotia, now Forest Nova Scotia, is entirely consistent with the hatchet job they are presently doing on the Biodiversity Act. If anybody is wondering where Forest Nova Scotia stands on the issues of conservation, ecology, and environmental preservation, their history is clear. They will fight against it tooth and nail, no matter the expense, at any given opportunity. For many years, I have referred to them as the pulp cartel, and in my experience, operations like these very much resemble those of cartels, manipulative, underhanded, and unethical. But the ultimate point here is that Forest Nova Scotia has a history of standing against environmental reform, change, and improvement in Nova Scotia. And every one of us who reside in this province rapidly losing its beauty to the depredations of clear-cutters, while its biodiversity falls victim to the ongoing pesticide treatments, need to keep that in mind come the next election time. Donna Crossland believes that Forest Nova Scotia has been emboldened by the ostensible success of their fear and disinformation campaigns, as well as character assassinations. And given that the Nova Scotia provincial government has not shown itself inclined to push for an investigation of the behaviors and the ethics of Forest Nova Scotia, she fears a bleak future for Nova Scotia's environment. Here are Donna Crossland's own words.
Well, as of right now, things have changed. Forest Nova Scotia has just demonstrated that they're in full control. And if we think we're going to be implementing Leahy, we can forget about that. Anything that's deeply meaningful that could be a big change on the forestry scene, it probably won't happen. The industry sabotage of the Biodiversity Act marks a point in history where it's a clear signal that we have changed direction, and things, the hope and optimism that I still had, the little bit of hope and optimism that I still had, disappeared when that happened.
The message is bleak and clear. Forest Nova Scotia has a history of opposing any form of environmental reform in the province of Nova Scotia. Anything which might adversely affect the profit margins of the pulp cartel, Forest Nova Scotia will use any means to suppress. If we want Nova Scotia to remain a green and beautiful province, a place that is a haven for wildlife, a place that people want to come from all over the world to see and experience our natural beauty, the time to act is now. There is so little, so very little, of our province's native ecosystem still intact, as I'm about to show you. Global Forest Watch is an organization that monitors changes in biodiversity and forest loss. And this map here presents their measure of forest loss in Nova Scotia just between 2001 and 2020. The imagery is shocking, and if the brakes are not put on the pulp cartel and something done to address the unethical actions of its mouthpiece, Forest Nova Scotia, there soon might not be a whole lot of ecology left in Nova Scotia to save. Thank you for watching. The Naturalist program is committed to the reliable coverage of all matter of topics relating to natural science, from ecology and conservation to the nature of the universe beyond our Earth, and making that information practical with solid advice on living well with the natural world. If you appreciate the program, please take a moment to subscribe. Subscribing costs nothing and never will, but it sure helps a lot.